Good day. My name is Malika Sardeshpande, and today I'd like to talk to you about exploring the human biodiversity interface through foraging. So, to begin with, foraging means search widely for food or things and is related to a number of words such as collect, gather, glean, harvest, or pick. So, I undertook a systematic literature review on the status of knowledge on foraging by human beings across the rural-urban continuum. I use this review string urban or peri-urban or rural and forage or foraging, and excluded studies in crop science and the livestock industry to look at foraging as a natural behavior. The results included studies in foraging by humans, mainly in rural settings, but also across the rural-urban gradient and urban ecosystems. I coded these studies using the social-ecological systems framework to answer questions like who forages, as in the resource users, what is foraged, as in the resource units, why human beings forage, as in the socio-economic drivers and resource systems, where humans forage, as in the ecosystems within which foraging occurs, and how foraging interacts with governance. As you can see, a lot of the literature was on who forages and why humans forage. Very little on the ecosystems within which foraging occurs and how it interacts with governance. I evaluated foraging as a livelihood activity using the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, described the diversity and resilience outcomes of foraging, and tried to look at how we can operationalize social ecological resilience through foraging. Now, before we get into it, why does any of this matter? There is an increased public and research interest in foraging, both in natural areas and in urban ecosystems, and therefore there is a need to investigate the impacts on human ecology and the ecosystems within which foraging occurs. And there is a rising investment in nature-based solutions, um, linking human health and well-being to biodiversity, and foraging forms a great bridge in that regard. So, looking at who forages, there are a number of indigenous peoples around the world whose primary lifestyle revolves around foraging, and their identity and existence is closely linked to foraging. There are also people that forage seasonally to bridge the gap between seasons as a complementary livelihood activity. There are people that are exposed to difficult conditions, such as being marginalized in society, or losing a family member, or being subject to famine or war. Then these people are exposed and use foraging as a means to overcome these difficult situations. Then there are farmer households and rural households around the world that complement or supplement their household economy using forage resources from their environment. There are also expert or specialized farmers and people that create high value products from their foraged resources. And then you have communities in rural and urban areas that forage as a representation of their sovereignty, as recreation, and also to reconnect with their natural surroundings, with their cultural heritage, and with their sense of self and spirituality. These are experiential foragers. So foraging as a livelihood strategy has its pros and cons. It enables people to have an economic and physical resource safety net. It reduces the risk of household economic failure during difficult times, and it helps people adapt to lifestyle transitions such as moving from rural areas to urban areas. However, the reliability of foraging as a resource and livelihood activity is variable, and the returns on your investment of effort are not always guaranteed. In terms of capital assets, foraging enables people to value, use, and propagate their natural capital, develop knowledge and human capital in terms of local resource use, enhance social capital through shared rights, responsibilities, and rituals, and shared physical assets, as well as financial capital through savings and costs and income generation. However, there is a limit to how many resources can be extracted out of a given ecosystem. The knowledge around foraging is often lost to modernizing lifestyles, and the resources generated from foraging might not necessarily translate into financial economies. Institutionally and policy-wise, foraging is generally governed as commons and is adheres to local cultures and traditions that are implicit and often not linked to governance and policy and institutions. So these may be threatened by emerging trends in globalization and urbanization where knowledge and codes of conduct are lost. Livelihood-wise, foraging is linked to improved dietary diversity, nutritional outcomes, and alternative systems of health, well-being, and production and procurement. It is one component of a suite of livelihood activities people undertake to fulfill their needs. These benefits are often dictated by socioeconomic background and therefore might not be distributed equitably. And cultural health and well-being benefits are long term, so they might not appear when people forage sporadically. And market forces might also influence demand for certain forage species, leading to adverse outcomes. So the large-scale patterns emerging from foraging are that foraging increases diversity and resilience, and I will present them as socio-ecological systems components. So for human ecology, there are some really significant studies that demonstrate that regular forages have a distinct microbiome that confers them with benefits such as fewer lifestyle-related diseases, and greater immunity. There's also the microscale level where foraging provides people with dietary diversity and better nutrition and food security. In terms of community ecology, being the small gardens, farms, or transhumance landscapes within which people forage, there is a diversity of species associated with the landscapes in which people forage, which makes them productive but also adaptive to shocks, environmental shocks. And the uses and functions that people associate with them enable the people in these resource systems to be more adapted to ecological shocks. Socially speaking, populations that forage form communities and local economies and alternative forms of being that enable them to access these savings on expenditure, create social cohesion, and also generate local ecological knowledge for sustainable use of their resource systems. In terms of ecosystem ecology, you may have noticed that there isn't a lot of literature on that, but the underlying trend is that there is a lot of biodiversity and a diversity of ecosystem services within landscapes where people forage, but there is need for further investigation. Similarly, foraging systems are associated with diversified farms, diversified markets, and ecological stewardship through land use, but there is need for more evidence. So drawing on that, I will focus here on the ecological aspects for directions for future research. We need to find out the different scales at which foraging is feasible and sustainable as an activity and look at the yields that come from different governance regimes. So do natural landscapes provide a greater diversity or quantities of natural resources for foraging, or can farms play a very similar role? What are the tolerance levels of different ecosystems to foraging, and what are the opportunities for participatory restoration using foraging? We also need to determine the natural and physical capital and the exchanges and flows of these across different types of land uses. We need to look at the adaptive capacity of foraging species, which ones of them are abundant, which ones are resilient to extraction, for example, and also look at long-term climate change scenarios. And we need to investigate experimentally the ecological response of species and landscapes to foraging. There's also directions for praxis, but in the interest of time, I will not venture too deeply into these. Now, I just want to quickly touch upon some of the emerging work in progress that I am conducting more recently. And you may recollect that a majority of the literature that was retrieved was on foraging by non-humans or more than humans. And therefore, I decided to investigate who do we share our ecosystems with? Which spaces and features do we share with these more than humans? What do we know about our interactions? And how can we design our ecosystems to facilitate synergistic coexistence? Now, I'm currently focusing on the urban side of things because that forms the bulk of the literature, but eventually I will move on to the rural and gradient aspects as well for comparison. Now, why does all of this matter again? Because there has always been interest in human-wildlife interactions, whether it is conflict or coexistence, but there's also emerging paradigms on One Health and what that means for human health, animal health, and planetary health. And there's an increased interest in rewilding both in natural areas, on farms, and in urban landscapes. So I believe that foraging by more than humans forms an important body of literature on what we know and how we could move forward. So can we take a few moments to try to guess who we share our ecosystems with? What are the top three contenders for the most common urban foragers? It turns out birds are the most common clade, followed by insects, followed by mammals. Now, what features do we share urban ecosystems with? And there are some patterns emerging there that include that built infrastructure, including roads, verges, and roofs, increase sunlight exposure and allow plants on these built infrastructure features to flower and fruit for a longer time, creating an abundance of feeding opportunities for wildlife. Artificial light, on the other hand, creates feeding opportunities for generalists such as insects and bats, but shrinks habitat for photosensitive species. Tall buildings tend to exclude biodiversity and form barriers. However, mid-sized buildings that do have connectivity with the ground and the natural landscape around them and have facades that allow for resting and nesting tend to be very important and, in fact, can be sanctuaries for bats, bees, and birds. Native vegetated green roofs can help conserve native biodiversity, and then there are other patterns such as the heat island effect caused by lots of concrete and built up surfaces can have significant impacts on the behavior, body reproduction, and populations of a number of clades from birds, insects to human beings. Roads can be a landscape of fear and fragmentation, creating conflict for larger land-based mammals in particular. However, street-side vegetation is a really important um, form of green infrastructure that provides connectivity for people, wildlife that flies, including birds and bees. So they tend to use this infrastructure like we do, going alongside it rather than going across it. Similarly, buildings tend to co-occur with a lot of anthropogenic food sources, and for species that are adapted to living with us, this improves their energy efficiency and breeding and population outcomes. Parks and gardens, especially in urban spaces, tend to be managed and better protected, and therefore provide a higher quality habitat for wildlife than informal and natural spaces in peri-urban areas that tend to face a lot more pressures from expansion and contamination in urban spaces. However, the key takeaway is the landscape mosaic surrounding urban infrastructure is equally, if not more important. It is irreplaceable habitat, and no matter how many of these other built features we have in urban spaces, the natural, unmanaged, or less managed landscapes in urban areas are the key habitat, and the other features are just connectivity. So further analysis that I'm going to undertake are to look at the patterns across the spatial ecological gradients, that is the rural, peri-urban, and urban areas, look at the flow of energy and nutrients through trophic chains, and look at the phenological and population level outcomes of foraging alongside human beings. And then I would synthesize this literature to look at how do we design infrastructure keeping in mind safe operating spaces for different types of species, particularly the ones of conservation interest? Looking at how we can enhance resource apparency and availability. Say, for example, putting up green roofs that make it easier for transiting wildlife, and looking at coexistence and carrying capacity of the different types of landscapes. And here I would stop and invite you to share your ideas and what you would like to investigate using this literature. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you.